Welcome to the webinar today. Our topic will be Innovating Toward Net Zero, a roadmap for oil and gas companies. My name is Thomas Briggs, a research associate here at Lux Research, and I will be moderating and presenting today's session. Giving the session today with me today is my colleague Chris Robinson, Senior Director here at Lux Research. Now, throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have into the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we will answer all the questions that we can. If your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we will respond when we can. If at any point you experience technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is functioning and strong. Now, without further ado, let's jump into the presentation. Take it away, Chris.
All right, thank you very much, Thomas, and thanks to all of you joining today. So obviously, we'll be talking a lot about oil and gas companies and really their journey toward net zero emissions. Many companies have announced net zero emission targets looking at 2050 with interim goals in 2030 and 2040. And what we've noticed in a lot of conversations with our clients here at Lux is that there's definitely a challenge with short-term financial pressures, things like higher interest rates, limiting capital deployment, that really have put tension between these long-term decarbonization targets and short-term actions to reduce emissions. Nonetheless, maintaining on a path to eventually reach net zero is really important, as we'll discuss today. So we'll talk about some of the strategies we think oil and gas companies should pursue to achieve net zero, and crucially, the technologies to support that. But I want to first give an analogy with the automotive industry. So I joined Lux about 10 years ago to lead our electric vehicles research. And I see a lot of similarities between an oil and gas company today dealing with these net zero targets and the challenges with automakers wondering how to reduce emissions from tailpipes in their vehicles. Now, hindsight is 2020. It's easy to sit here today and state that electric vehicles are the right bet in the automotive space. I don't think I've really met anyone to date with a really good reason as to why something other than electric vehicles will form the backbone of the automotive space looking forward 10, 20 years. But that wasn't always the case, right? I can look toward 2013 as really being a crucial point in time, as when I think even laggards in the automotive space started taking electrification very seriously and starting to invest and build technology platforms to produce electric vehicles. And that, of course, is when the Tesla Model S was released, the first, in my mind, electric vehicle that really had everything consumers wanted: four-door sedan, more than 200 miles of range. Pretty quickly, we saw leaders from the incumbent automotive industry start to catch up pretty quickly. 2017, we had the first sub $40,000 electric vehicle that could travel more than 200 miles. And that was kind of our first inflection point in 2017. We saw a big jump as that and the Tesla Model 3 were released. And then the next really big inflection point came just after the pandemic. I know I was one of the people trying to buy a car in 2022, and really the dealer markups over MSRP for electric vehicles are significant. There's a big mismatch where there's a lot of consumer demand, especially built up from COVID, but not exactly the supply of electric vehicles. Now, looking at this plot, as we continue to move right, you would think the headlines and a lot of the industry discussion were continually positive given the growth rate, but that wasn't really the case. It was last year I started to notice more headlines coming to my inbox from these industry pain points: electric car demand is slowing. Now, never mind the fact that growth continued, albeit at a slower rate, right? 21, the jump was over 100%. Now we're looking at a jump of about 33%. But nonetheless, we have seen a lot of pullbacks, right? Just this week, Volvo announced that they were no longer targeting becoming a pure electric vehicle company by 2030. We've seen this year Ford announce they were rolling back some of its planned models, so cutting back the number of new vehicles it was going to be releasing, including a three-row SUV. And so I think in a lot of cases, there's this tension between, again, long-term, the strategic goal, everyone understands the industry is moving toward electrification, but challenges on a short-term basis. Now, we'll come back to the automotive industry, but let's look at the oil and gas industry. And I think I see a lot of parallels right now where a lot of the technologies, we're seeing pauses, we're seeing pullbacks, we're seeing canceled projects. right? And these are some of, I picked three of the more read news commentaries that we've written this year. And all of them were really about project pauses, either from the supply of electricity in the case of DAC, or I think more market demand concerns for some of the SAF or bio-based projects. And similarly to automakers pulling back on some of their long-term targets, we have seen oil and gas companies pull back on their targets. Exxon has increased its forecast for demand for oil and gas products looking out through 2050, while even some companies have started to weaken their targets. Now, the question is, should you abandon net zero ambitions? Should you forget thinking about what your organization will look like in a net zero future? Well, let me ask you this. Should automakers stop investing in electrification? I would say the answer is no, but we have seen those organizations really adjust their tactics just based on the timing of the market and the timing of when technologies are going to mature. And I think that's what the oil and gas industry is experiencing right now. I think we can look long-term at some of the IEA forecasts, seeing that in a best case scenario for the oil and gas industry, look at Exxon anticipating flat demand, stated policy scenario again showing flat demand at best for these products. So you're not going to see the growth that you saw in the past, and in all likelihood, you're going to see demand for these products erode, which makes it critically important. Even if you're not acting on it and writing big $100 million checks around technologies to support your transition, you do still need to have that long-term strategic view of what your organization is going to do and look like in a net zero future. So now I want to talk about what are those strategies. And here we've outlined the 5 strategies as part of our net zero strategy framework for oil and gas companies. The idea is these set of strategies will help you achieve a net zero company in the future. So they encompass the status quo strategy, which is really about continuing existing operations in conventional oil and gas, but offsetting emissions either with carbon capture units or things like buying credits, carbon credits. We have the new fuel strategy, which really sees a flip-flop where you no longer view transportation as just the biggest market for the core product you make, but rather the new fuel, the transportation market is the core market you're focusing after, and you diversify the number of energy carriers you do to supply that. You have the chemical strategy, where instead of just selling feedstocks and materials into the chemicals industry, you're actually moving downstream, acquiring or becoming a chemicals producer yourself. We have the sequestration strategy, which is really about building a business around carbon management, not just deploying carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration on your own facilities, but building those for other industries like steel and cement that need to decarbonize. And lastly, we have the power strategy, which really embraces electron as the energy carrier of the future and focuses on building a business around supplying components to enable electrification or becoming a retailer yourself. Now, one important note before we jump into the details on these strategies is they are not mutually exclusive. In fact, we expect most large international oil companies to need to deploy multiple strategies to maintain their market capitalization, because some of the strategies we talk about actually entail going after a smaller market. So with that, I want to walk through each of these strategies, talking about the pros and cons of each strategy, talk a little bit about kind of where we see the strategy trending in terms of companies embracing or moving away from it in the last year. Then finally identify some technologies that should be on your radar if you're interested in this strategy. So we'll start with the status quo strategy. Now, in the IEA's forecast of their net zero scenario, in a net zero world, the oil and gas industry is worth about $600 to $700 billion USD. The reason there is there are some hard to abate industries that will need to decarbonize via carbon capture and offsets rather than fundamentally moving toward a new process. But the volume of those oil and gas products will be much lower than today. Now, we've noted this as trending upward. As I said earlier, I think a lot of companies are once again returning to their core, scaling back bets in some of these other strategies and putting more chips in this strategy, so to speak, just based on some of the short-term financial pressures. Now, the benefit of this strategy is really the fact that you have existing demand for a product. Right? This doesn't require you to go out and find a new market, a new customer, develop a new process or technology. So it's somewhat a safe bet in that regard. And we expect to see consolidation increase in the future. We've already seen a lot of consolidation in the industry. When you see companies like ExxonMobil talking about it, they pump more barrels per day right now than ever before. It's worth noting a lot of that came from acquisitions, right? Someone like Pioneer Natural Resources. So we expect to see more consolidation in the future, which means a lot less competition within this status quo strategy, though it is worth noting, you're aiming for a shrinking target, right? This market share, the size of this market will continue to decrease. And I think one really important thing is you really miss out on opportunities for tech innovation. And I think that's been something foundational of the energy industry and the oil and gas industry, is that there has been a lot of technology developed and implemented, not just for the oil and gas sector, but spun out into other areas as well. And so no longer would the oil and gas industry really be a premier technology development leader in this strategy. So in terms of the technologies required for this strategy, some are obvious, right? So managing and tracking and reducing emissions is critical. So that's why we see some things like methane detection, platform electrification to help reduce and actually measure those emissions. But really, if you're thinking about this strategy in net zero future, you have to be thinking about carbon negative technologies that reduce and take CO2 out of the atmosphere. And that's really where we see a lot of interest in carbon capture, one of our more popular topics that we've talked about over the last couple of years. And within the carbon capture space, obviously there's a variety of incumbent technologies. Mostly we see things like solvents and sorbents used today. But when it comes to direct air capture, there's a lot of energy required for the desorption cycle. And while in an industrial setting with point source, you might have some waste heat on that facility you can reutilize for that. That's not the case with direct air capture. So one of the technologies we're most excited about that could lead to a future cost reduction would be electroswing, where you're electrifying part of that process, avoiding the need to generate a lot of heat, which is very expensive from an operating expenditures perspective. We also have the new fuel strategy, excuse me, and this is again where we really look at the transportation market as being the key primary market you focus on as an organization, becoming agnostic of the source of that energy. So not just oil and maybe gas, but also looking at electricity for EV charging, biofuels, or even beyond that, synthetic fuels for applications like aviation. Now, from a market size perspective, this is the second largest market we look at, probably about $2 trillion in the future. And really, I would say that the advantage here is the large stable market, right? Even coming out of a pandemic, which a lot of people reduced their need for transportation, today we still see robust demand for moving people and things. And I don't think we'll ever see a decline for that, even in the future. So there is going to be demand to provide energy for transportation. Also, if you're a downstream oil and gas company or have retail operations, you have a really good view of this market. You have a pretty good insight into the consumer's mind, understanding a lot from operating a fuels business that could be translated to the to a EV charging business if you think about passenger vehicles, or supporting the aviation and marine sectors as they look to decarbonize as well. But one of the challenges here is kind of the opposite of one of the challenges in the previous strategy. And that is here is you have to master a lot of different technologies. You can't just bet on one carrier like hydrogen and expect to succeed in all these areas, right? We know electrification is going to win in passenger vehicles. Some questions about its ability to decarbonize things like heavy-duty trucking, but then applications in the marine space or the aviation space, where really electrification is an option, might require other carriers. So you have to have a lot of diverse skill sets in this strategy. In terms of the technologies to monitor as part of this, again, they are very diverse, ranging from hydrocarbon fuels, carbon capture solutions, as well as new molecules, right? Think about water electrolysis or things like methanol that could be derived from captured carbon and hydrogen as well. But the one technology that we want to highlight that I don't think is on most people's radars is actually battery swapping. Now, battery swapping is not necessarily a new concept. A few companies have tried pursuing this in the past, but with limited impacts at scale. We started looking at the economics when you do have scale. What if you wanted to electrify a fleet of taxis? What would the cost look like if you pursue battery swapping, fast charging and storage versus fast charging? Really what we found is if you can generate a high enough utilization rate, battery swapping makes a lot of sense for electric vehicles, while also reducing consumer pain points, allowing for a 2 to 3 minute top up of getting a full charge and reducing impacts to the grid as well. So this is one area where especially downstream oil and gas companies that have retail operations should be monitoring the battery swapping space for activity from automakers. Now we'll move on to the chemical strategy. And again, this is moving downstream, not just supplying materials and feedstocks to the chemicals industry, but actually become a producer of chemicals yourself. And this is the smallest market, about half a trillion dollars globally in the net zero scenario from the IEA. But we have seen increasing interest in this from companies like Total Energies and especially Aramco, right? The latter investing in their kind of crude to chemical strategy, recognizing they want to still produce crude. Some of their demand for transportation might be eroding, but translating crude to chemicals provides a new market. It's been making some investments moving downstream in this market to support that strategy. Now, the advantage here, which Aramco is definitely leveraging, is your market cap. Right? You're dealing with smaller companies, so you can pretty easily move into this space via M&A, muscling out existing companies, leveraging that higher market cap. But the flip side of that coin is you have to convince investors that a smaller market is really worth going after. An advantage here as well is you can really control the entire supply chain, right? From extracting raw materials, processing those raw materials into feedstocks used for chemical production, and actually making the chemicals and selling them themselves is now all owned by one entity, an oil and gas company. However, it's worth noting some of the regulatory challenges you might think you're escaping as part of the in the oil and gas industry in terms of pressure to decarbonize. You're going to find different ones in the chemical space, namely things like regulations on PFAS or forever chemicals. Now here, there's a range of solutions. At Lux, when we talk about decarbonizing industries, we like to think of it in terms of our decarbonization radar, where makeshift technologies don't require any process or step changes. Retrofit introduces maybe one modification of a step, but doesn't change the underlying fundamental process. So for example, it still might be a thermochemical process, but you add carbon capture unit onto the end of it, or a transformational process, a fundamentally new process and way of producing chemicals. As you can see here, we have some biological routes as well as electrochemical routes in our transformational category. Now, today, I think the early stage of those transformational technologies and the high costs, they won't have an impact in the next 5 to 10 years. We have sensed a lot of interest in bio-based chemical production, particularly things like producing biomethanol as near-term opportunities today. So next we have the sequestration strategy, which is again, where you build a business being a provider of carbon capture solutions. Now the market forecast for this is a little bit trickier to assess. We think it's going to be about $1 trillion in 2050 in that net zero scenario. And I would say here, we are increasing the amount of activity we see aligned with this strategy. The best example, I think, of a partnership that kind of exemplifies this particular strategy is ExxonMobil's work with Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, where really they have partnered to provide a one-stop solution for capture, transportation, and sequestration for companies. So they're going to steel companies, they're going to cement companies with a carbon capture solution, trying to build it for them and manage it. Even springing in some investments like the Denbury acquisition, which is likely geared at providing that CO2 infrastructure for that solution. Now here, like the status quo strategy, you can leverage your existing expertise. Oil and gas companies already have extensive expertise in carbon capture technologies, as they've been the primary developers of those for the last 20, 30 years or so. But also, if you just look at the skill sets required and the assets required, they might have some depleted oil wells or suitable sequestration sites, for example. So you have a lot of the existing expertise and assets to move into the strategy. One of the challenges, though, is that really it's very regulatory driven, right? You're going to capture CO2 and sequester it only if there's some external incentive, like a tax credit of some kind or a carbon marketplace where you can trade credits to reduce costs. Otherwise, it's just an added cost and it's essentially landfilling that CO2. And I think those regulations are pretty safe. I don't think we'll see those prices declining or going away. But nonetheless, it's worth noting we're talking about a regulatory driven market. So there are going to be geographic constraints where this might make sense in one market and others not so much. And so we've done a lot of work within the carbon capture space, including led by Thomas, our moderator today, really trying to assess a lot of the companies developing carbon capture solutions. Because if everything we talk about here, point source carbon capture development is really table stakes for the strategy. You're not going to enter the market with direct air capture. You're likely going to enter with working with industry on some of these solutions. And so we've been doing an assessment of all the different companies developing them, finding that there's some solutions ready today. If you look at that top right quadrant of leaders, 5 of the 8 solution developers are focused on solvents, the most mature. But there are some opportunities if you look in the top left, someone like Mantle. mantle capture that is developing a more application-specific integrated carbon capture solution, which we think does provide a good indication that in the future, we will see more carbon capture firms becoming more specialized, integrated with the processes that they capture. Elsewhere on this list of technologies, of course, is actually transporting and using and converting that CO2 as well. So finally, we have the power strategy. This is where, again, you embrace electron as the energy carrier of the future and build a business around electricity. Now, on one hand, it does have the most attractive market size of roughly $4 trillion in the year 2050 in the IEA net zero scenario. However, it's very difficult to access that total addressable market in that, unlike oil, which you can put in a tanker and ship around the world, electricity is not so fungible of a commodity. So you are restricted by certain geographies and physical infrastructure like transmission distribution that limit where you can actually deploy some of these solutions. Now, this is an area where I would say clear downward trending a momentum from the industry. We've seen companies like Shell exiting the space. They had a position, especially in the UK, as one of the leading retailers and have since moved out of that, directly just citing that, hey, this is just a very expensive loss-making endeavor for us. Now, worth noting there, it's a tactical change because they're still very active as a provider of commercial energy solutions to things like industrial and commercial supply entities. And they're developing solutions like hardware, long-duration storage technologies that could be used in the power sector as well. Now, similar to chemicals, there are acquisition opportunities for some of the distribution utilities. We have seen some interest from oil and gas over the years, though again, I think that's waning today. But one of the challenges here is that the electricity sector is undergoing its own pretty fundamental change, moving away from fossil-based generation toward intermittent variable renewables. You could look at that as an opportunity to come in with a new set of solutions, but at the same time, it's worth noting you are entering an industry undergoing an immense change, and that will come with some challenges on its own. Now, we usually think of innovative technologies falling in one of three buckets. Could be low carbon power, so making electricity, storing and transporting that electricity, or managing demand of that electricity to be more flexible to match when generation is available from intermittent and variable renewables. And concern over that intermittency has really driven a lot of interest in nuclear small modular reactors, which is a topic that over the last couple of years we've been asked quite a bit about. Now, we've been doing some cost modeling in this area as well, similar to others I've shown. And ultimately, really in a best case scenario where everything goes according to plan, all the cost reductions and regulatory and licensing fees are achieved, shortened construction times are achieved, it's feasible that an SMR could be cheaper than large-scale fission reactors. However, it is unlikely, given the challenges of deploying and building nuclear today. So in a likely scenario, it will remain more expensive alternative. However, it is essentially available around the clock. And we've seen a lot of interest from industrial customers with very high amounts of electricity you need because you have the density of power generation in a nuclear reactor that you don't get from necessarily solar or wind. And with some reactor designs, potentially some waste heat that's available to use. So we've walked through the strategies, and I want to end today with giving you some guidance on how to go about implementing them. I think the first step here is assessing your core expertise. Look at your position in the value chain. I think upstream companies have tremendous experience understanding what happens underneath the Earth's surface, both from an exploration perspective as well as from a drilling perspective. We've already seen them leverage into opportunities in natural hydrogen or geothermal, for example. There's downstream companies, immense expertise in thermochemical processes, looking at novel fuels production, or even some maybe novel technologies like thermal storage, where we have seen some thermochemical solutions proposed, could be a way to leverage that. We should also reevaluate a geographical footprint. Something that's very different that I alluded to earlier is, unlike oil and to some extent natural gas, electricity is not fungible. And some of the things you want to do in one area might not be feasible in other areas. This extends into regulations as well, where, as we mentioned with carbon capture, some regions have support and the right potential sequestration sites that make it really attractive, whereas others might not. So look at where your geography is, think about the technologies that are applicable to that geography. And if you want to move into others, consider doing so via M&A. And finally, the last step here is really identify technologies that might be weak spots within your strategy. Identify and start pursuing developing strategies to build those into your portfolio via open innovation initiatives with accelerators, incubators, academic entities, or outright acquisitions of some of those companies. And importantly, clearly communicate your strategy to stakeholders. So to wrap up today with a few key thoughts, one, I want to kind of re-emphasize that although I think we're seeing a bit of rollback, return to business as usual from the oil and gas industry, it would very much be a mistake to lose sight of what your organization looks like in a net zero future. It's important to maintain that vision. So as you adjust tactics responding to some of these near-term pressures, you don't lose sight of your ultimate objective. The second is the challenging part, avoiding hype and making sure you're picking the right technologies, right? You don't want to be the automaker that bet on fuel cells. I think Toyota's still kind of catching up from that a little bit, though certainly their bet on hybrids really helped, right? But what I showed today using cost models, using decarbonization radars to understand how industries will decarbonize can help you pick and make sure you have the right solution. And finally, let's acknowledge capital spending is always limited in today's current economic environment. So instead of writing $100 million checks and bigger to some Series C, Series D companies looking to scale climate tech, if you don't have that appetite for scale, look smaller. Leverage relationships with academia and other innovation clusters to help advance your position to monitor and deploy some of these technologies. So thank you, and I think we can move to the question and answer section now.
Yeah, thank you for that presentation, Chris. So we'll now be taking any questions that you may have on the presentation. You can type those into the questions box, or if we don't get to them on the call, please email them to questions@luxresearchinc.com, and someone from Lux will be in touch after the webinar. So I'm seeing some questions coming in here. The first is, what role will corporate venture capital play moving forward, do you think? Is it likely going to increase or decrease in importance as time goes on?
Yeah, I do think right now, the importance of corporate venture capital is somewhat low. Right? There's an environment where I think there's a lot of hesitation to deploy capital given high interest rates, also the valuations, and frankly, a lack of exit strategy from a lot of startups has kind of tempered that enthusiasm. But I think I've already started hearing some things where we're starting to see oil and gas companies look beyond things like carbon capture, hydrogen, alternative fuels, which has maybe been the backbone of a climate tech strategy. Start to look beyond that, move some of those into more, kind of mature scale businesses, and start to refocus on some of those emerging opportunities. So as we do that, I think really we're entering a period where we might start to see that pendulum start to shift again, where the role of corporate venture capital becomes a little bit more important for some of those long-term scouting opportunities.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I'm seeing some other questions come in here as well. When do you think companies will begin looking at these long-term opportunities with enthusiasm? When are we going to shift out of this mindset here?
Yeah, I suppose I kind of touched on this with my last response as well to the previous question. But to answer it again, yeah, I think we're starting to see that shift happen right now. But I think the challenge is kind of the allocation of resources, so to speak. I think we still don't see massive teams going after long-term opportunities. It tends to be very small teams operating on a kind of a very lean budget that are kind of tasked with monitoring and providing an outlook on technology strategy for these large companies. So, in terms of when are they going to begin looking at those, I don't know if they necessarily lost sight of them. Maybe in the last few years they did. But I do think that right now, everyone's looking toward 2025 and thinking, what are the early stage things that should be on my radar looking in the future? So I think we're kind of right in that period right now where that momentum is starting to change.
Yeah. All right. I think we have time for one more question here. You mentioned battery swapping. Is that something that's being done today?
Yeah. So at certain geographies and at certain scales, the answer is yes. I think Better Place was the company that tried to do this about 10, 15 years ago now, but really tried to do it before there was enough volume of vehicles on the road. There just wasn't enough stock of electric vehicles to support a network like that. We do see it at scale in China. I think estimates single digit thousands of battery swapping stations from a couple of different companies. But really have just started to see other pilots emerge. I would pay close attention to a company called Ample. They've been working with Mitsubishi and have some investment from Shell. And they've actually started testing their solution on medium-duty trucks in Japan as well. So I do think, as we see more electrification interest happening in the commercial sector, provides a bit of an opportunity there because they don't have quite the patience for charging times. There's a financial impact associated with time spent charging. So yeah, the short answer is yes, it's being done today. But looking at the future, the big challenge with passenger vehicles is standardization, right? I don't think Ford and GM are going to agree on using a single battery pack type or technology. So we're going to have to sort out, the standards challenge. But given the upside of minimizing grid impacts, the fast charging speeds, I think that's something that will be overcome over time.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that brings us to the end of our time here. So thank you for the presentation today, Chris. And that does conclude our webinar. The slide presentation and the recording of this webinar will be sent to all attendees via email. And after leaving the webinar, you're going to be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation. And we really would appreciate any feedback you may have to help inform and improve some of our future webinars. So at this point, just take a moment, check out some of our upcoming webinars. Thank you for joining us, and please have a great day.